ever produced, the weary, wisecracking, world-weary romantic whose face and voice defined an entire idea of American manhood. He was Sam Spade and Rick Blaine and Philip Marlowe, the cynic with the buried streak of honor, the man who insisted he stuck his neck out for nobody and then did exactly that when it counted. He won an Academy Award for The African Queen, was nominated for Casablanca and again for the Caine Mutiny, and left behind a body of work that essentially invented the modern American screen hero. But the legend obscures a far harder truth because Humphrey Bogart did not float to the top on charm. He was born on Christmas Day in 1899 into a comfortable, well-to-do New York household, the son of a surgeon and a successful magazine illustrator, and by any reasonable reckoning, he should have had an easy life. Instead, he served in the Navy at the end of the First World War, drifted into the theater, and spent years as a stage juvenile, playing polite young men in tennis whites, about as far from a hardened gangster as it is possible to imagine. He clawed his way there over more than a decade of humiliation, playing cheap hoodlums who got shot in the last reel of pictures nobody remembers, watching lesser men take the parts he deserved. And, unlike so many of the gracious, easygoing legends of his era, Bogart genuinely was a scrapper, a needler, a man who drank hard, argued harder, and seemed to actively enjoy a confrontation. So this list has real conflict in it, real documented friction, real enemies. But the strangest and most revealing thing about the battles of Humphrey Bogart is where they actually came from, and who the real adversaries turned out to be. Because the man most responsible for holding Bogart back also, entirely by accident, handed him everything, and the enemies who did him the most lasting damage were not people at all. So let's go through the 6 great battles of Humphrey Bogart's life, the real adversaries of the screen's greatest tough guy, starting with a rival who made him a star without ever meaning to, George Raft. In the pecking order at Warner Brothers through the 1930s, Humphrey Bogart was near the bottom of the leading man list, stuck behind marquee names like Paul Muni, James Cagney, and Edward G.T. Robinson, and behind the smooth, coin-flipping gangster George Raft as well. The best scripts went to those men, and Bogart got what was left over, which meant 6 long years after his breakthrough in The Petrified Forest, spent playing crooks and killers in second-rate pictures, dying in Reel 5 over and over again. And that breakthrough itself is worth pausing on, because it contains the single most generous act anyone ever performed on Bogart's behalf. He had electrified Broadway as the escaped killer Duke Monte, but when Warner Brothers bought the film rights, the studio had no interest in casting an unknown stage actor and wanted an established name instead. It was the film's star, the elegant English actor Leslie Howard, who flatly insisted that Bogart play the part or he would not make the picture at all. Bogart never forgot it. Years later, he and Lorne Bacall named their daughter Leslie in the man's honor, long after Howard had died when his airliner was shot down during the war. The most consequential relationship of Bogart's early career was not a feud at all, but a debt. By 1941, he had passed 40 without a real leading role. He was balding. He had none of the conventional good looks of a matinee idol, and it looked very much as though he would finish out his career as a supporting heavy. Raft, meanwhile, had the clout, the billing, and the contractual right to refuse material he didn't like, and he used it. He turned down the lead in High Sierra. Then, when the young John Huston was handed his first directing job, Raft turned down the part of Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, reportedly because he had no faith in a first-time director. Both parts fell to Bogart. High Sierra started the turnaround, The Maltese Falcon completed it, and legend has long held that Raft passed on Casablanca too. In the space of a year, the roles George Raft didn't want transformed the 42-year-old journeyman heavy into the biggest star in the world. It is one of the great ironies in the history of the movies, the rival standing directly in Bogart's path. The man whose stardom had kept him in the shadows for years was also the man whose bad judgment handed him immortality. Try to imagine the alternative for a moment. Picture George Raft flipping his coin through the fog at the end of Casablanca, or Raft delivering the line about the stuff that dreams are made of, and the whole edifice of 20th century movie mythology wobbles. Raft himself lived another 4 decades watching the parts he had rejected become the most celebrated performances in American cinema, which is surely one of the loneliest fates ever handed to an actor. There is no evidence the 2 men carried on any great personal war, and they had worked together perfectly civilly more than once. But in the only sense that finally mattered, the professional one, Raft was the obstacle standing between Bogart and everything, and the obstacle removed itself. The second battle was a genuine, documented, openly reported feud with the studio's golden boy, and it was rooted in everything Bogart resented about how Hollywood distributed its rewards. Errol Flynn. Flynn was everything Bogart was not: staggeringly handsome, athletic, effortlessly charming. the swashbuckling star of Warner Brothers' most lavish and expensive productions, a man to whom the whole business seemed to come easily. Bogart was a decade older, thin-lipped, scarred, and grinding out his living in pictures Flynn would never have been asked to make. In 1939, the two were thrown together on the Western Virginia city, in which Bogart was grotesquely miscast as a Mexican bandit, complete with a false mustache, in one of the more embarrassing assignments of his career. The set was a nest of resentments, so much so that the columnist Sidney Skolsky reported the whole mess to the public in November of that year, noting that Bogart and Flynn were feuding, that Flynn was also feuding with his leading lady Miriam Hopkins, and that the director Michael Curtiz was feuding with her as well. It was less a film production than a collection of grudges pointed at a camera. Bogart, who had a needling, sardonic tongue and no particular gift for keeping his opinions to himself, was not the sort to suffer the arrangement gracefully, and Flynn, who had spent his career being adored and forgiven, was not the sort to take criticism from a supporting player in a fake mustache. The clash was one of temperament and, more pointedly, of status. Flynn was the anointed favorite, the studio's pampered prince, handed the budgets and the costumes and the adoration, while Bogart was the perpetually passed-over professional watching the easy money go to the beautiful man, and he could not keep the contempt out of his voice. It is not difficult to understand. Bogart was in his 40th year doing serious work in disposable pictures, while a man 10 years younger sailed through the studio's crown jewels on charm and a fencing lesson. It is one of the few authentic, publicly acknowledged actor versus actor feuds of Bogart's career, and it says a great deal about what was really eating him during those long years in the wilderness. The third battle was the longest war Humphrey Bogart ever fought, waged for the better part of a decade against the man who owned his contract and, effectively, his life, Jack Warner. The studio system of that era gave actors almost no control over their own careers. A contract player was told what to make, when to make it, and for how much, and the only weapon available was refusal, which the studio answered with suspension, meaning no work and no pay until the actor crawled back. Bogart used that weapon relentlessly. He fought Warner over scripts, over billing, over money, over the endless parade of interchangeable gangsters, and the studio suspended him for it 11 separate times. 11. That is not a temperamental star throwing the occasional tantrum. That is a decade-long campaign of attrition, waged by a man who was perfectly willing to go without a paycheck, rather than accept another part he considered beneath him. The arguments ran through the night, and Bogart, who genuinely enjoyed a fight and who had a lawyer's instinct for an unfair bargain, kept coming back for more. He was handed genuinely humiliating assignments along the way, as punishment and as filler, including a hillbilly musical in which he played a wrestling promoter, a picture he later regarded as the single worst piece of work he ever committed to film, and an absurd horror sequel in which he played a mad scientist returned from the dead. He kept fighting anyway. And the remarkable thing is that he won. Those battles eventually secured him top star status and top star money, $3,500 a week, putting him at last on the same footing as Cagney, Robinson, and Raft, the very man he had spent years fighting his way past. He was hardly alone in this. Bette Davis, Cagney, Flynn, and Olivia de Havilland all waged similar wars against the same studio. But Bogart's was among the most stubborn, and his refusal to be quietly warehoused as a supporting heavy is the reason the world eventually got Rick Blaine. There is a cynical reading of these battles, offered at the time by some who watched them, that the studios rather enjoyed the spectacle, that a public quarrel generated free publicity and saved the payroll while the suspended actor sat at home. Perhaps there is something to that, but the fact remains that Bogart risked genuine unemployment in an era when a blacklisted or troublesome contract player could simply vanish from the screen forever, and he did it repeatedly. And he did it repeatedly. And he did it because he believed he was worth more than the studio had decided he was worth. It is the defining fight of his professional life, and everything that followed rests on it. The fourth battle was not fought on a set or in a studio office at all, but at home, and it was by some distance the darkest and most damaging chapter of his private life. It also needs handling honestly rather than as an amusing anecdote, because underneath the colorful nickname the newspapers gave it, this was a story about two people drinking themselves to pieces. Mayo Method. Bogart married the actress in August of 1938, and by all accounts, she was warm, funny, and good company when sober, but both of them drank heavily, and drink turned the marriage into something genuinely destructive. She became convinced he was unfaithful and grew increasingly paranoid, and their fights escalated from throwing crockery to real violence. She set their house on fire. She came at him with a knife, and she harmed herself on several occasions. Bogart, for his part, was no innocent victim in this. He needled her mercilessly. He seemed to relish the confrontation, and at times he gave as good as he got. The press, Delighted, christened them the Battling Bogarts, and their friend the screenwriter Julius Epstein compared the marriage to a sequel to the Civil War. Bogart even named a boat after his wife's nickname, treating the whole grim business as a running joke. But there was nothing funny underneath it. This was two alcoholics destroying each other over the course of 7 years, a mutual ruin dressed up by the gossip columns as colorful Hollywood eccentricity. Read the anecdotes now, and the comedy drains right out of them. The private detective she hired to follow him, the fires, the wounds, the endless suspicion, the escalating drinking on both sides. These are not the charming misadventures of a glamorous couple. They are the recognizable symptoms of two people in serious trouble who had nobody in their lives willing to say so out loud. Methought had been a working actress with a real career of her own before the marriage, and the years with Bogart and the drinking that ran alongside them took that from her. It ended only when Bogart fell in love with a 19-year-old newcomer named Lauren Bacall on the set of To Have and Have Not, divorced Mayfaut, and married Bacall in 1945. Finally finding the steady, happy partnership that carried him through the rest of his life. Mayfaut's own decline continued after the divorce, and she died a few years later, still a young woman, a genuinely tragic figure whom the Bogart legend has tended to reduce to a punchline. She deserves better than that in the telling. Whatever she did in those terrible years, she was a sick woman losing a fight with an illness that was barely understood at the time, and rarely treated as one, and the same could fairly be said of the man she was married to. The fifth battle was the one that cost him the most, not in money or roles, but in self-respect. The Political Inquisition of 1947. When the House Un-American Activities Committee began hauling Hollywood writers and directors before it that autumn, Bogart did something genuinely brave. Along with John Huston, William Wyler, Bacall, and a roster of the industry's biggest names, he helped form the Committee for the First Amendment, and in October the group flew to Washington to protest the treatment of the accused and to defend the principle that a person's politics were nobody's business but his own. It was the sort of thing his screen characters did, the cynic finally standing up for something. The roster of names that attached itself to that committee reads like a roll call of the era's finest. Katharine Hepburn, Henry Fonda, Gene Kelly, Danny Kaye, Groucho Marx, Judy Garland, Burt Lancaster, Edward G. Robinson, Billy Wilder, and then it collapsed. The hearings went badly. It emerged that some of the accused had indeed been Communist Party members, a fact the Committee of Protesting Stars had not known when it took up their cause, and the delegation suddenly found itself looking less like a principled defense of civil liberties than like a group of famous people who had been used. Public opinion turned savagely against them. The press began treating the protesters themselves as suspects, and Warner Brothers leaned hard on its biggest star to separate himself from the whole business or watch his career burn. Bogart caved. He issued a statement calling the Washington trip ill-advised and foolish, and followed it with a magazine article under the humiliating banner declaring that he was no communist, claiming he had been duped. His liberal friends regarded it as a betrayal, a man selling out his principles to protect his box office. And by many accounts, Bogart agreed with them. It is said he regretted the retraction for the rest of his life and never entirely forgave himself for it. It is the one moment where the real man could not live up to the character he played on screen, and he knew it, and it haunted him. And it is worth being fair to him about it. The pressure brought to bear on those who declined to fall into line in 1947 was not abstract. Careers were ended, men went to prison for contempt, and an entire blacklist descended that would destroy livelihoods for the better part of 2 decades. Bogart was 48 years old, had spent a decade and a half clawing his way to the top, and was being told plainly that it could all be taken away. Most people in that position do exactly what he did. The reason it stings is simply that he was Bogart, and the whole world had decided that Bogart was the man who did not back down. He had to live afterward with the gap between the myth and the man, and by every account he found that gap very hard to bear. And the sixth and final enemy was the one that actually killed him, the constant companion of every other battle on this list: the bottle and the cigarettes. Bogart's drinking was legendary even by the standards of a hard drinking industry, and it was not merely a colorful habit. Through the late 1930s and early 1940s, he was turning up at the studio with hangovers of genuinely spectacular proportions, and he was barred from at least one Sunset Strip establishment for the disturbances he created. There is a famous line attributed to him about the whole world being 3 drinks behind, and it captures both the wit and the problem in a single breath. What is remarkable, and what speaks to the professional underneath all the belligerence, is that he almost never let it damage the work. He arrived letter-perfect, knew every line, and delivered one immaculate underplay performance after another in pictures that scarcely deserved him. Colleagues who watched him do it marveled for years afterward at the discipline it must have taken, but the bill came due. The drinking fed the ruinous years with Methote, it fed the belligerence and the needling, and combined with his relentless chain smoking, it destroyed his body. He was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, and he fought it with the same stubbornness he had brought to Jack Warner, joking with visitors, refusing to be pitied, insisting on being carried downstairs in a wheelchair to receive his friends. He died on January 14, 1957, 3 weeks after his 57th birthday, weighing barely 80 pounds. His funeral was a deliberately simple affair with music by Bach and Debussy, and the church was filled with the biggest names in Hollywood: Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, Bette Davis, Judy Garland, David Niven, Danny Kaye, and many others, a great many of whom had crossed him at one time or another and had long since forgiven it. The toughest man in the movies was killed, in the end, by his own two favorite props. It is a bleak irony that the very habits which built the persona, the cigarette forever burning, the glass forever within reach, the weary squint of a man who had seen too much, were the same habits that took him at 57, when he was working at the height of his powers and had every reason to expect another 20 years. So what is the honest takeaway from the many battles of Humphrey Bogart? Unlike the gracious, universally beloved legends, Bogart really did have enemies, and he really was at times a difficult and combative man. But look at the shape of the list, and something surprising emerges. There is essentially one true actor versus actor few cases loved. He was not a man who hated other actors. He was a man who hated being told what he was worth, and he spent his whole life proving the estimate wrong. First to Jack Warner, then to an industry that had written him off as a supporting heavy at 40, and finally to a disease he refused to let see him flinch. The great irony of Humphrey Bogart is that the ultimate screen cynic, the man who claimed he stuck his neck out for nobody, kept sticking his neck out anyway, for better parts, for blacklisted strangers, for his own dignity. In the end, no rival actor was ever Bogart's real enemy. The only opponents that ever truly mattered were the ones who tried to tell him who he was allowed to be.